good notes are such that 3/4 of the page should be white. 1/4 should be articulated in such a way that you, at first sight, visually, you recognize the structure. So that later on, when you learn, when you try to memorize, that you have a look, one glance on a page and you know it, and so you continue. You are not born as a good note taker. You learn that step by step, but it is very important. Now, what you read, the books which we use, that is, how should I say, that is to put muscles on the skeleton, or to put flesh on the skeleton. But the skeleton must be there, so that you know where to put what you assimilate in your readings and in your studying in your books. I have the 3 books here with me. Let me remind you what you are supposed to know on Friday. Out of FEST, to begin with FEST, I told you, and I have mentioned that already relatively early, we have 4 personalities on the agenda. Röhm, Göring is the one which is mentioned first in FEST. Göring, the number 2. Göring was already around also in Hitler's first putsch, the Munich putsch. Röhm was there from the beginning on, the lost generation. In the first putsch, he will be there also when Hitler did rise to power, and he will be there again, tragically, in the first year after Hitler was in power. So Göring, Röhm, then Goebbels, the specialist in terms of propaganda. He and Hitler were the best speakers. And the 2 were, in a sense, equivalent in terms of addressing masses. So Goebbels did not play an important role in the Munich. I think he was even absent. He appears on stage after Munich. And then he will, being critical towards Hitler at the beginning, after the first meeting he had personally with Hitler, he would practically subordinate himself. He, who was after all an intellectual, I would say, with a lot of frustrations and inhibitions, but he became like Hitler's servant. So Goebbels. And then the man about whom we are going to talk a lot today, Papen. Papen, that if you look on your notes, he was the one who was practically brought to power after Brüning had not been able to solve the problems, and after Schleicher had practically suggested to the president to dismiss Brüning, who was made responsible for Hindenburg's, let's say, bad result in the first round of the presidential elections of 1932. So these are the 4: Göring, Goebbels, Röhm, Papen. And I will give you the choice between 2. Now, do not commit the mistake of saying, well, he's probably going to pick so-and-so, so I do not even look on the 2 others. You should never do that, because that can be deadly. If you just pick the ones which I will not ask, and where you don't know anything. And there is one thing I cannot stand, I warn you right away. That is, if you do not know anything about an answer, and nonetheless you try to write something in order to impress me. I am not impressed this way. On the contrary, I get furious, because I lose so many seconds or minutes in my poor life reading this kind of literature, which is nothing else but a desperate attempt to produce something, whereas in reality, a blank page I would even prefer. On the other hand, I do not like blank pages, so to prepare it, do not make selections. So far for FEST. In Davidovich, I told you the 2 first chapters, that is the Jews in Hitler's mental world and anti-Semitism in northern Germany. We will concentrate on Davidovich for the final test much more. Then in Bullock. In Bullock, it's those of you who have opened the Bullock book. I hope that everybody has, even though I'm not always sure. I know some of you from past experiences too well. That is not now a bad judgment. It's a realistic assessment. So it is book one. Book one, that is party leader from 1889 to 1933. I return to where we left off last time. That is, remember, last time we essentially saw how the Weimar Republic, have a look again on the spectrum of the parties, how the Weimar Republic reacted to the crisis, and why the crisis, once it started in October 1929, immediately hit Germany, because Germany lived on American money, on American loans, and any crisis starting in the United States was bound to rebound immediately in Germany. Now, first stage, the coalition government of four parties, the Müller-Bauer government, could not last because they were practically, let's say, neutralized by the government coalition. On the left side, the trade unions, on the right side, big business. So this government did resign, and Brüning came in, who was brought in by Schleicher, the man, the manipulator, the operator behind the stage. Brüning made the mistake of not trying to find a majority inside parliament before having the crazy idea to have the parliament dissolved. And I told you, if you look on 20th century history or even 21st century, no government is well inspired to organize elections in times of crisis, because the democracy operates that way, that the public will make the government responsible for all the hardships it is in. And so every government loses if elections take place in a crisis situation. So, first elections, spring 1930, results, the Nazis appear strong on stage, and the communists made progress. And then Brüning made two major mistakes, and we will come back to those when we are through with the end of our topic today. He abused of the presidential decree. The presidential decree was meant to be used in case of emergency, which means it was meant to be an exceptional measure to get out of a crisis situation, and not a permanent means to rule. That was an abuse of this constitutional power of the president, because the consequence was he ruled bypassing parliament like a dictator, even though he was not a dictator. But he did this, and this way the German public and the German political body got accustomed to this kind of dictatorial situation, of which Hitler will take advantage. And secondly, he used the policy of the worst. He knew, and because he saw what the consequences of his deflationary policy were. His deflationary policy first did not bring the country out of the crisis, did not rekindle a new start of business, and on the contrary, increased unemployment, bankruptcies and unemployment. So in other words, the two consequences, which we see also in the present day crisis, were of course of a nature to increase the dissatisfaction of the rich, of big business, and of the trade unions, with the consequence that the communists and the Nazis will capitalize on this, and the Nazis in particular, because remember, Hitler had as his intention to draw practically support from every layer of the German society, even though it would be, of course, essentially also from the German right, from the German conservative middle class and upper middle class circles. So I do not review what happened. Brüning failed, and after the second round of presidential elections, he was forced to resign, and in comes Papen. I already, I suppose that some of you have already done the studying of Papen, his background, originally from the Zentrum Party, Catholic, but in reality close to the conservative, to the nationalist, and with a good tune for the president. He knew how to please Hindenburg. But once he came in, he immediately became aware that he had no majority. And so he did the same, because he was not, in addition, that he did not have the majority, he was not intelligent, so he had learned no lesson from Brüning's mishaps. So, new elections in the summer, July 1932. And in these new elections now, the communists and the Nazis made a sensational progress. The communists, they moved up till practically 89 seats, and the Nazis 230. Now, if you combine this, so in the communist Nazis, this means in practical terms that it is practically impossible to rule, because the Nazis and the communists together, they practically had a majority in parliament. And it was unthinkable that they would make a coalition, because they hated one another. They had one thing in common. Each of them wanted to bring the Weimar Republic down. They were absolutely anti-Weimarian. But of course, they hated one another, and they were, internally speaking, of course, deadly enemies. Nonetheless, this meant that Papen was in an impossible situation. And so Papen then approached Hitler. He offered Hitler to make a coalition government with him and the nationalists. And he offered Hitler the vice chancellorship in such a government. He would be the chancellor. Hitler turned this offer down. For Hitler, it was all or nothing. So the parliament got together during the first, and in this situation, the president of the parliament, do not make the confusion between the president of the parliament and the president of the republic. The president of the republic being Hindenburg. In this case here, the president of parliament was Göring. Göring was Hitler's second man. So he represented the strongest party. The socialists, they had something like 120 seats, but far behind the Nazis. And the other parties, they had lost seats, all of them. So what is important is that Göring, as president of parliament, he lived in a house not far away from parliament. And in this house, there was a possibility to go to parliament through an underground gallery, through an underground tunnel. He did not have to step out of his house and walk any kind of a distance over to parliament. He could get inside parliament by using this underground tunnel or this underground gallery. This will be important later on. What we will not see today, but when the parliament all of a sudden a fire broke out in parliament, and everybody was thinking, well, how did they get the material to put the parliament building on fire? We will see that after our break, after the midterm. Now, so during the first meeting, Göring managed even to expose Papen to a certain ridicule, because Papen had arrived with already a new decree, presidential decree, of dissolution of the just elected parliament. But Göring would not, as president of parliament, Göring was presiding over the session, and he would not give Papen the means. So the first thing which was voted about was a vote of distrust against the new. in other words, he was not even given the chance to present his program or to dissolve parliament, but Göring had a vote where a majority of parliament voted against Papen. Anyway, Papen, who had not the slightest chance, dissolved parliament again. So after a second dissolution of parliament. And after that, Hindenburg wanted to have a meeting with Hitler to get an idea of who Hitler was. And in this first encounter between the old president and Hitler, Hitler for once did not feel at ease during this meeting. And Hindenburg's impression about this Bohemian corporal, he called Hitler, this Bohemian corporal. Hindenburg told Papen, but this guy, I can't appoint him even as post minister. So in other words, the impression was very bad. But the Nazis made a mistake now. During the electoral campaign, particularly in the Berlin area, they dared to make a temporary agreement with the communists against Papen, against the other parties. And big business had a keen eye on this, so that they would get less money for their electoral campaign. And when now in September the new parliament was elected, the Nazis' vote decreased. The Nazis went down to 194 or 96, I forgot. And the communist vote went up. So in other words, the new parliament now had a situation where it looked as if the Nazis were on decline, that they had passed their climax, and that they were going down. So in these elections, the communists continued to advance. They were now 100, the Nazis were on a decline, but still, they were the strongest party. But the overall situation, politically speaking, had not changed. That is, in this situation, it was impossible to have a majority, because the communists and the Nazis together practically had a majority, and there was no way that this could work. Now, in these circumstances now, Papen, he could not repeat his little game of dissolving and having new elections. So Papen now had the idea to make a political coup. He went to see the president and told Hindenburg that he should use the presidential decree, that is this exceptional power, to change the constitution and give him, Papen, dictatorial powers to rule now practically without parliament and continue, to bypass, to make a constitutional change. Now, at this point, when Papen made this proposal to Hindenburg, he was not alone. He had with him Schleicher, because Schleicher, the general, had been in Papen's ministry, Minister of Defense. He had ultimately stepped into the public as Minister of Defense. And he did not hide his disapproval of Papen, because when Papen first was introduced to Hindenburg, and when he became chancellor, even though he did not get a majority, but nonetheless, Schleicher considered that Papen was his puppet, and that Papen would do what he would tell him to do. Now, what was not his surprise? When Papen practically developed ideas of his own, not now being the puppet of Schleicher. In other words, Papen approached the president without Schleicher, and he got along pretty well with the president. So in other words, Schleicher discovered that his tool had become too independent, so he wanted to get rid of Papen. So when Papen made this proposal to the president to use the presidential decree and give him dictatorial powers, Schleicher stepped in. And Schleicher told the president that he would veto such a measure, because he said, in this case, if you do that, this will practically provoke an uprising, an upheaval of the communists and the Nazis together, that they would, of course, they would feel eliminated from the political stage, and they would start an uprising. And in case of such an uprising, this would be major political and also military disturbances. The German army could not handle such a double uprising, and Schleicher said, the Poles will take advantage of this internal civil war situation to invade Germany and cut off other pieces of Germany on its eastern border. In other words, the Poles would take advantage of this internal trouble to expand territorially at the expense of Germany, and Schleicher said that the German army could not handle domestic troubles of this nature and at the same time a more than likely invasion of the Polish army into German territories on the eastern border.
Was it actually likely that the Poles would have invaded?
Well, we do not know. I mean, there were no immediate indications that the Poles would do it, even though the relations between Poland and the Weimar Republic were very bad. And there was a great hostility between the two countries because the Poles had occupied a territory where a German majority had lived and a Polish minority. And so, in other words, let's say the likelihood of such an action on the part of Poland was not now just fantasy, imagination. They might have done it, but of course this was never tested because the reality was different. And so of course Hindenburg was taken by surprise because he had been willing to grant Papen these powers. And then Schleicher ultimately stepped forward and he said, if you appoint me as Chancellor, I will be in a position to get a majority in the German parliament. And of course, with such a proposal, Hindenburg, who was not pleased at all about the new evolution domestically, Hindenburg couldn't do anything else but appoint now Schleicher to be Chancellor. But on one condition. He told Schleicher that he would give him 2 months. This meeting did take place in late November, early December. So he said, you'll have 2 months to come back and show me a government which has a majority in parliament, because Hindenburg was getting tired of ruling all the time through presidential decrees. Now, what was Schleicher's calculation? What did Schleicher imagine? Now, you take up the little scheme I was putting on the blackboard. Well, the Nazis on the right, the communists here, the SPD, socialist here, then the DDP, the Zentrum, the DVP, and the DNVP. Now I'm just teasing you a little bit. Do you know what those abbreviations mean? Who is hiding behind the NVP?
The nationalists.
Yes.
Hugenberg,
the nationalist. Who's hiding behind DVP?
Stresemann and the liberals.
Yeah, the Stresemann when he was alive. Now he was gone. The right-wing liberals. The Zentrum, everybody knows. DDP, left-wing liberals. SPD, everybody knows that. Then the KPD. Now, Schleicher's calculation was the following. He would, of course, exclude absolutely to form a government with the communists. So Schleicher imagined that I'm sorry that I should have stood here, that his coalition government would reach from the SPD on the left to the Nazis on the right. In other words, the whole bloc outside the communists. He imagined that he could set up a coalition government with attracting all those parties. Now, of course, in this calculation, it was essential to get the Nazis in. Now, of course, there was no question that Hitler would, under no circumstances, join such a government. But that was not Schleicher's intention. Schleicher imagined that he could split the Nazis. And the Nazis had a left wing, let's say a left wing which was a little bit more socially minded. And the two brothers who were considered as the leaders of this left wing were the brothers Strasser. Strasser, you spell it capital S-T-R-A-S-S-E-R, Strasser, Gregor Strasser. Otto Strasser, his brother, had already practically left the Nazi party. So Gregor Strasser was the leader of the left wing. Now, in other words, in practical terms, Schleicher imagined to form a government which would be supported by the socialists, the left-wing liberals, the Zentrum Party, the right-wing liberals, the nationalists, and, in order to have a majority, the left wing of the Nazis. Now, he tried to approach those parties, but it was essential, of course, to provoke the split among the Nazis. And on that issue, he failed totally, because Gregor Strasser was not always in agreement with Hitler. He had a certain following, but he was a very pale figure as a champion of a group which would split away. Instead of trying now to enter Schleicher's game and try to call up for a turning away from Hitler, he went on holidays to Italy. So in other words, Hitler had practically free hand to keep his party together. And he did. In other words, the attempt to split up the Nazis, this attempt failed miserably. But that was not all. Schleicher could rely on the support of the conservatives, of the nationalists. But all other parties distrusted him because he was considered as the operator, as the intriguer behind the stage. So in other words, the socialists turned him down, the Zentrum Party turned him down, and the others did not want to have anything to do with this general. So at the end, at the end of January 1933, he went back to the president and pitifully had to admit that he had not been able to put up a majority in parliament for his government. And so, strangely enough, Schleicher came now with the same scheme which Papen had presented to the president 2 months earlier, to make a political coup, that is to change the constitution and grant him, Schleicher, as head of government general, dictatorial powers. Now Hindenburg, of course, turned to him and said, well, how come that the argument you used to veto Papen's proposal, that these arguments are not valid any longer? How about an uprising of the Nazis and the communists and a Polish invasion? So in other words, he dismissed Schleicher. But meanwhile, Papen had not remained inactive. Papen was absolutely furious about the way he had been countered. He had been practically treated by Schleicher. That Papen resented the way Schleicher had practically removed him from the power position. So he was now, Papen was now intriguing behind the stage to get back to power. So he secretly approached Hitler. And in this case, he presented a scheme to Hitler that they should make a coalition government, the Nazis and the conservatives, including the Zentrum. Of course, the Zentrum, that was another matter. But in this position, nonetheless, Papen was not, in his secret negotiations with Hitler, negotiating in a position of strength. On the contrary, he was in a position of weakness. So in other words, in this case, he had to propose to Hitler to become chancellor. He would not, because Hitler would not have moved for less. So Papen offered Hitler the chancellorship, and he would become vice-chancellor. Now, in order, nonetheless, to keep control over Hitler and the Nazis, this coalition government would include, on the one hand, 3 Nazis, and on the other hand, 10 nationalists, with Papen as vice-chancellor, also in a key position. Now, who were the 2 other Nazis? We know already one of them, Göring. Göring would enter this government as minister without portfolio, that is, as minister without a very precise field of action on the federal level. But they had meanwhile practically dissolved the Prussian government. So he became, in the new Prussian government, which was practically set up at the same time, Göring would be Minister of the Interior. In this, responsible for the Ministry of the Interior in Prussia. The 3rd Nazi, we haven't mentioned him yet, but he played a key role nonetheless before, even though he was not as prestigious and not as, let's say, media-oriented. That was Frick. Frick, you spell it F-R-I-C-K. Frick would become Minister of the Interior on the federal level. So in other words, the new coalition government with the 3 Nazis and 10 nationalists would have Hitler as chancellor, head of government, Göring, minister without portfolio, responsible for the Ministry of the Interior in Prussia, and Frick, Minister of the Interior on the federal level. Now my question to you is, what was Hitler's interest to have the 2 ministries of the Interior, one on the federal level and the other one on the Prussian level, in Nazi hands?
Wouldn't that be the secret police?
Not only the secret police, the police, yes. He had control over the police force. Political police, criminal police, normal police. The police would be in Nazi hands. Now, I open a parenthesis here, because there were some people who learned from this. And those who learned from this were the communists after World War II. When the communists, so this is a parenthesis, but just put it into your passive memory for later days with somebody else. The communists after World War II made coalition governments with the non-communist parties in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Hungary, everywhere. But they looked to it that the Ministry of the Interior would always be in communist hands. Okay, and Hitler knew why. Now, among the 10 ministries which were in conservative, in nationalist hands, was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The man who was responsible there was Neurath, N-E-U-R-A-T-H, N-E-U-R-A-T-H, Neurath. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Defense was also in nationalist hands. This will be a general by the name of Blomberg. We will meet him a little bit, not today anymore, but next time. Blomberg, B-L-O-M-B-E-R-G, Blomberg. Then the Ministry of the Economy. We know this fellow. The Ministry of the Economy was given to Hugenberg. Hugenberg, the leader of the nationalists. And I do not go over the other ministries. So at first sight, Papen seemed to be right, that although the Nazis were, Hitler was the chancellor, but he had with him 10 conservatives, 10 nationalists, and a vice-chancellor, Papen. Nonetheless, and Papen was extremely sure of himself. He said, I cornered him. He was naive. He was absolutely naive. So, when Schleicher was dismissed after he had failed to put up a coalition government, Papen was introduced by he was introduced to Hindenburg, and he came with Hitler, and so he told Hindenburg that they had a majority in parliament, nationalists and conservatives. He was not totally right, because they needed, in order to get this majority, they needed the support of the Zentrum Party. The Zentrum Party had to join this coalition. Without the Zentrum Party, they did not have a majority. Now, Hitler looked to it that the negotiations with the Zentrum Party, that these negotiations would fail, because he had other calculations. The point was, nonetheless, that everybody had misjudged, totally under-evaluated Hitler's drive to power and Hitler's way of acting once he was appointed to be Chancellor. And he was appointed on the 30th of January, 1933. Hitler was appointed Chancellor, head of government, with his coalition government, which needed the Zentrum support. So this is how Hitler ultimately came to power legally. This was not a political coup. He was appointed by the President of the Republic, Hindenburg, and in a coalition government. So in other words, the conclusion he had drawn after the failed Munich putsch, that he would try to seize power by using the legal path, had succeeded. He was in power, and the same evening, the same day, the Nazis demonstrated. They organized a huge parade of the SA and the SS it was a kind of victory parade. With candles, they moved through Berlin. They now were in power. So this was the curriculum Hitler followed from 1929 on, or from 1924 on already. But from 1929 on, this was the way how, step by step, in the 4 years which followed the breakout of the crisis, he came to power. Now, after seeing what we have just done now, after seeing events in chronological order, how chronologically 1929, 1930, 1931, 32, 33, how he got to power, you look over your notes, 1929, outbreak of the crisis, Müller-Bauer government. Nothing happens except that the crisis will plunge the country ever deeper into a crisis. Then the Brüning government, with the mistakes Brüning made, I'm not repeating it, and the crisis continued. 1930, 1931, Brüning's attempt to make a customs union with Austria, bad failure. 1932, the year of the many elections. First round for presidential elections, second round for presidential elections. Hitler comes out very strongly, immediately behind Hindenburg. Then Papen government, dissolution of parliament, July. The Nazis come out very strongly. Second dissolution of parliament, September. The Nazis seem to be on the decline. The communists continue their advance. Then intrigues behind the stage, Schleicher against Papen, Papen against Schleicher. And then ultimately, January 1933, as a consequence of this backstair intrigues, Hitler comes to power with, in a coalition government with Papen. Yes?
Why was Hindenburg okay with Hitler being in a leadership position when he had just run against him?
Well, you know, this is politics. He could not resent that Hitler was a candidate against him because there were other candidates also which would, I mean, in the political game, you see, but look for instance, how Obama appointed Clinton to be his secretary, his state secretary. Although the two were running against one another in the preceding, let's say, elections inside the Democratic Party. That's a part of the game. Yes?
How could Papen and Hitler come to this agreement that Hitler would become chancellor when wasn't it really Hindenburg's power to appoint the chancellor? Couldn't he have selected Papen over Hitler?
In that case, he had done it already, but in that case, Hitler would not have come along to be a member of a coalition government. And Hindenburg was getting tired of ruling through presidential decrees. He wanted to have a government which would have a majority in parliament. And so that's why he ultimately agreed, because he considered that after all, with 10 nationalists and 3 Nazis, that this government should operate in such a way that, if the government had worked normally, like any government, then there would have been government councils where they would have discussed issues. And if they had discussed issues and if a vote had been taken internally inside this government, with 10 nationalists and 3 Nazis, the Nazis would have always been in a minority. But Hitler had not the slightest intention to organize a meeting of his government. He would simply run the show as head of government and leaving the other ministers aside. And that is what Papen did not understand, and that is what the nationalists did not understand. That Hitler's demagogical drive to power would, of course, not tolerate that inside the government he would be put into a minority situation. Are there other questions? Please ask them now, because after that I will try to explain to you what elements played into Hitler's hands, because for the time being we have made now a chronological approach. How did Hitler step by step from 1929 until 1933 come closer and seize power ultimately, thanks to Papen? What I would like to do afterwards, if you have any questions relating to what we have seen, I would then analyze the situation, not now in chronological order, but try to understand which circumstances, which conditions, which elements, which personalities played a role which made Hitler's rise to power easier. I do not say which made Hitler's rise to power unavoidable. Nothing is unavoidable. Because it would have been normal that Hitler would not have come to power because the Nazis were on the decline when he ultimately came in. But he made it nonetheless. Because there were circumstances, there were persons, there were elements which played into his hands. And that's what I would like to examine now. In other words, the new topic which we have now after seeing Hitler coming to power is how, analytically speaking, what circumstances, what conditions, what events, what persons played a role in Hitler's rise to power? Now, first, we have to look on the peculiar circumstances, on the peculiar situation of Germany and the German people after World War I. Because Germany and the German people after World War I were not in what you would call a normal situation. Because in the 10 years which followed World War I, the German people did endure or was exposed to 3 major shocks, to 3 major blows. Each of these would have been enough to set off balance any country or any people. Now these were 3. In 10 years they came one after the other, which of course would create a situation of total insecurity, of total bewilderment and unbalance of the German public opinion. And if you keep in mind, to begin with, that Germany and the German people were a country which did not have any kind of preceding democratic experience. Because when Bismarck united Germany and gave Germany a constitution, this constitution was a conservative one, where parliament did not play the key role. There was a constitution, there was a parliament, but it was not parliament which decided ultimately about politics. It was the emperor, it was the executive, or it was the chancellor who acted in the name of the emperor. So in other words, there was an authoritarian constitution where the German people elected a parliament, but a parliament which had not the final say in running the country. So in that sense, Germany was without democratic parliamentarian experience, the German people. They were exposed to this experience only after World War I. But of course they were exposed at a moment when then 3 blows came, so that they simply were knocked off from a normal functioning population, from a normally functioning constitution or people altogether. Now, which were the 3 blows? The first blow came, that was the defeat and the peace treaty. You must imagine, of course you have to make a major act of imagination. Just imagine the United States would lose a war, but not only not win a war, but would lose a war despite of the strength of the American army, and would then be humiliated, would have to sign a peace treaty where it would have to endure unbearable conditions. That is unthinkable, of course, at the present time. But nonetheless, to explain to you the shock the German people felt, that they were from the top position getting down to the lowest position. Defeat, peace treaty. That was the first. This hurt the German sense of national pride. And this was a feeling which was shared by all Germans. They all considered that this was a disgrace, a humiliation, and that they would not accept it. That is the first blow. Defeat, peace treaty. Second blow, related to this, and who came then 4 years later, 1923, total inflation. When the German currency was practically reduced to nothing. Remember, $1, 4,000 billion marks. Now, in what sense was this a blow? Well, this was a blow for the middle class, for the lower middle class, and for the middle class in general, that is, for that part of the civil society which was the very basis of stability in a country. The middle class has to support, and that is how all Western democracies function, that the middle class will look to it, that will support the government. Here, the middle class was ruined. And this ruin now opened the middle class to the propaganda which the Nazis will use. In other words, the middle class lost its confidence in the future of the Weimar Republic. And in Germany, the middle class was very important in terms of number. It was, if not the majority, at least close by, of the majority of the German people. And of course, this was a bad blow. They did not really have confidence into their own country. And then comes the third blow. The third blow was 1929, the economic crisis. Now, the third blow was, of course, hitting most sensitively the poorest part of the population and the middle class again. The poorest part because unemployment. You had all of a sudden more than 6 million, close to 7 million unemployed. Now, for a country like Germany, this was, of course, a lot. And there was no sight out of the tunnel. In other words, it looked as if they would never get out of this. So, in other words, in 10 years, defeat, humiliating peace treaty, inflation, and now the crisis, unemployment. So that was, in this sequence of blow after blow, this was too much for the German population. They were looking around for somebody who would get them out of it. And this somebody was waiting in the wings. And even though this somebody was not an ideal figure, at least he promised that they would get out of all this. And that, of course, played into Hitler's hands. Because how could a man like Hitler, a man from the gutter, how could he have made it otherwise in a normal situation? Germany was not in a normal situation. There is a second element which also played into Hitler's hands. And that was the scare of communism. The scare of a repeat of a communist revolution in Germany. In other words, the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and what Lenin did, this scared the German people, and more particularly the German middle class. Because it was not that communism was not only a theoretical threat, it was a real one, because in Germany there was one fringe among the workers, among the industrial workers, which before World War I had started a movement in the direction of lower middle class. But the hardship which followed the World War I, the poverty and the unemployment, all this radicalized the left-wing fringe of the German workers, and says that the KPD, the Communist Party, did rise on this dissatisfaction and on this revolutionary background which came into existence as a consequence of the war and also as a consequence of the Bolshevik Revolution, because the Bolshevik Revolution seemed to be the alternative to democracy. And this alternative had represented a certain temptation for one element of the German proletariat. And of course, this scared off the middle class. The same element had played a role in Mussolini's rise to power in Italy. In Italy, Mussolini stood up as a savior from the red danger, and Hitler will do the same. So in other words, the fact that there was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, that there was a communist party in Germany, which was growing in influence. They had started with somehow 57, or let's say with a small party, and at the end of the spectrum they had 100 seats. They were the third strongest party after the Nazis and after the socialists. So this played into Hitler's hands. And then there is a third element, which we have already seen. The third element was the Weimar Constitution. I would like to repeat once more, because those who have come along with Mr. Backes, and I was also on this study tour, I explained why the Constitution was elaborated in the city of Weimar. in 1919, from late February until May 1919. It was not, the Constituent Assembly did not meet in Berlin, which had just before been the stage of a communist attempt to seize power, and there were still, I would say, the consequences of this fighting which had taken place. So they elaborate the constitution in Weimar, and that is why the name was ultimately given to the republic itself, the Weimar Republic. Now, we have seen the flaws of the constitution of the Weimar Republic. I'm asking you the question, which were those flaws? The most important flaw.
It gave the presidential power to take over.
Yes,
In case of-
the excessive powers of the president. The president could dissolve parliament without consulting anybody. The president could appoint a chancellor of his choice. And the president could, in case the government would not get a majority, the president could, in an emergency situation, rule through presidential decree. And last not least, the president was not elected for 4 or for 5 years, but for 7 years, which is a long tenure. So in other words, the excessive powers granted in the constitution to the president. And Hindenburg will not have a good judgment that he would, as a consequence of his entourage, that he would abuse of these powers. And this played ultimately into Hitler's hands. What is the second flaw? Yes?
Proportional representation.
The absolute proportionate representation, that the electoral law, which granted any party a seat regardless on how weak. It all depended on the proportion of votes they would get. And of course, I mentioned to you that these flaws were avoided in the constitution of the present-day German Republic. And what was the last flaw?
The size of Prussia's power?
Yes. The Prussia practically represented, in terms of size, in terms of population, in terms of wealth, 2/3 of the whole country. So you could have a contradictory situation where the government of Prussia would be formed by a different coalition than the federal government, and that one government could neutralize the other one. This last flaw will be avoided simply by splitting up Prussia after World War II into so many smaller units, smaller lenders. Now, that was a flaw, and Hitler did take advantage, essentially, of the, I would say, of the two major flaws, that is the presidential decree and the electoral law, because the electoral law did have as a consequence that the parliamentarian system was discredited before the German public opinion, because there were no stable governments. So, in other words, the unstable governments and the horse trading taking place behind the stage, this had as a consequence that the population was waiting for a strong man, like Bismarck, to take over. But of course, Hitler will not be a Bismarck. There was a fourth element which played. And this fourth element was Brüning's policy. Brüning, for 2 years, the chancellor, from the spring of 1930 till the spring of 1932. And we have already pointed out in what sense Brüning's policy paved the way for Hitler, even though, I would like to stress that very clearly, Brüning was a Democrat. He was a decent man, and he hated Hitler. In other words, he was not Hitler's man in Havana, playing a role in paving the way for Hitler's access to power. But nonetheless, involuntarily, he paved the way for the Nazis and for Hitler, for 2 reasons. We have already mentioned those. First, he is the one who convinced Hindenburg to give him presidential decrees for 2 years, so that he could rule bypassing parliament. So in other words, Brüning's practice of ruling Germany, of running the government, was a dictatorial practice. And by doing this, the German people got accustomed to this kind of non-parliamentarian way of being governed. And that was Brüning who did this. And that was it was not only a mistake, it was also an abuse of an exceptional power which the president had following the constitution. Then the second element, which also, where he was responsible, was his deflationary policy. He practiced a deflationary policy, although he should have seen that this deflationary policy did in no way get Germany out of the crisis. On the contrary, put Germany deeper into the crisis, increased the number of bankruptcies, and dramatically increased unemployment. Now, he was not blind. He saw. Not any normal politician would have corrected this. But why did he not correct it? Because he was following, with this deflationary policy, he was following a goal of foreign policy. He wanted to get rid of the reparation issue. To get rid of the reparations. And if he would get rid of the reparations, then he would switch around and correct his wrongdoing. But in what sense did he pave the way for Hitler? Because he seemed to be absolutely incompetent and in no position to solve the problem. Hitler could attack him continuously and say, look what a kind of a chancellor we have. Not only does he not lead the country out of the crisis, but his policy has just the opposite effect. And so, in other words, he had a policy which created absolute depression, also psychologically speaking, and despair in the country. And, of course, pushed the masses into the arms of Hitler. And that is not all. Then comes another element, which also played into Hitler's hands. And these were the intrigues. The intrigues of the two individuals, Schleicher and Papen. In other words, they are intriguing behind the stage in order to get to power and to stay in power and against one another. These intrigues paved the way for Hitler. After all, Papen did get back to Hitler in order to take his revenge on Schleicher. These were backstage, behind the stage intrigues. Without these two miserable individuals, Hitler would have had no chance. But of course, Hitler did take his chances. So the role of these two individuals are an additional element which played into Hitler's hands. And then the last part we should not forget nor neglect. And the last part, of course, is Hitler himself. That even though Hitler had all kinds of flaws of character and he was let's say, an individual of poor historical or cultural background, but he was first a master propagandist. He knew how to attract the masses, how to speak to the masses, and politically speaking also, he had the nerve to wait for the right moment. He turned down several offers by Papen to take over the vice-chancellorship. Now, this is not now a normal reaction on the part of a politician. You know perfectly well, a politician, when he's offered to be part of a government or to be outside of a government, they just jump on the opportunity to be a part of it. Hitler turned it down. It was all or nothing. And he waited. Even though when his party seemed to be on the decline, because Papen offered him once more, before he himself was dismissed by Hindenburg as a result of Schleicher's intrigue, he had offered him the vice-chancellorship once more after the elections of September 1932, when the Nazis had lost more than 30 seats. And any normal politician would have said, well, look, and there were members of his party who tried to push him. They did not dare to speak out, officially speaking, but who hoped that he would seize the opportunity and enter a coalition government as vice chancellor. He turned it down and waited until he would get all of it. So in other words, Hitler's talents as an extraordinary demagogue and as a politician who could wait for his hour, this also played a role. Because others would have acted differently, but he waited for the right time. So when we pass in review now these elements, which were the elements which played into his hands, the shock, the three shocks following World War I, the scare of the Bolshevik Revolution, the flaws of the constitution, the political tenure of Bröning with the mistakes he made, the intrigues of the two individuals, Schleicher and Papen, and ultimately his own exceptional, they were exceptional, qualities as a demagogue and as a man who could wait. All this played into his hands so that he ultimately came to power on the 30th of January 1933. But let me nonetheless point out that this was not an unavoidable situation. In other words, unlike what some journalists and some historians tried to fabricate afterwards, that Hitler was a kind of logical conclusion of the wicked minds of those Germans who from earlier days on had nothing in mind but racialism, anti-Semitism and what have you. No. It might have turned out differently, but it did not. And I would like to pass in review now the syllabus and the different parts we developed in class from our first meeting on. For the books, you know what I expect you to prepare. Now for your notes. Remember, our first topic was the impact of World War I. There are events in history where historians, after a certain amount of time, once they are over, historians recognize of being a watershed, of ending one period and beginning another one. This way, for instance, the ancient history very often is considered not the beginning, because the beginning is the end of the prehistorical time period before before documents could be produced by men. But usually the fall of the Western Roman Empire is considered as being the end of ancient history. The same way at least there is not always a full consensus, but nonetheless, a majority of historians agree that the end of the 19th century does not coincide with the calendar 19th century. It's not 1900, but that the end is 1914. That is the beginning of the 20th century, that World War I. World War I had a tremendous impact. And we saw in class, during the lecture, the different aspects of this impact, the magnitude of the losses, of human losses, the magnitude also of the means which were used for purely destructive purposes, which caused the ruin of nearly of all European countries. Even the winners were in bad shape. The only country which did come out now, let's say, with a minimal of these scratches or of this kind of elements was the United States, which is not a blame, but it's simply they came in and brought the decisive turn in the war and came out without this kind of an impact on its own territory or on its own population or on its own economy. We also saw that there was a change in climate, in the mood, in the general attitude of the majority of people, that from optimism, pessimism spread around. And what was particularly dramatic was that all this coincided with the arrival, I would say, on the platform with full political rights of the masses. In most countries, universal suffrage was established, also for women. And of course, there couldn't have been a worse period than to bring in the citizens to full maturity when everything was in shambles. That is also something Hitler did take advantage of. We also saw that this created a power vacuum in Central Europe, that one big power practically imploded or exploded, giving birth to smaller countries which were, of course, not in the same kind of a position to withstand aggressive expansionist tendencies of powerful neighbors. And these powerful neighbors were weak for the time being, but will recover. This will be Germany and the Soviet Union in the evolution which followed World War I. We also saw that, I do not expand again on the economic and monetary situation, but we also saw that there were positive positive consequences which did not catch the eye, that I would say in their positive aspects, that the outsiders of before 1914 became the insiders after 1918 in terms of fine arts, in terms of music, in terms of sciences. One other thing I've already mentioned, the universal suffrage, also women's suffrage, except for France. But the other element which also played a role was the advancement of the women's cause in terms of equality. It was still a far cry. There is not even equality now achieved, but nonetheless, as women had taken the place of men in the factories and in other places, they did not all return to their homes. This promoted at least women's, I do not say liberation, but nonetheless, women's acceptance as being equal of men went one important step forward as a consequence of the war. But altogether, the negative consequences prevailed, because without World War I, there would not have been Lenin and Bolshevism and the triumph of communism in Russia. There would not have been fascism and the rise to power of Mussolini in Italy. There would not have been National Socialism and Hitler in Germany, even though Hitler's rise to power came a little bit later. But from all we have seen, that was a consequence of the war. And what we also saw, that regardless of what the official proclamation at the end of the war was, this was a victory for democracy. Less than 10 years later, all the democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe were gone, and there were everywhere dictatorships, conservative military dictatorships everywhere. So that in that sense, World War I had let's say, a dramatic effect on the evolution of Europe, and also on practically on the world evolution, because the afterwards consequences of National Socialism, of communism, and of fascism will be felt in the 30s and in the early 40s will practically lead straight to World War II. That was one part of our syllabus, the impact on Europe, as we will concentrate, of course, on the European stage, but we could even look upon it wider. Now, the second part which we developed, as this will be important, was anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism on the European stage and, of course, also in Germany. The long history of anti-Semitism, going back to ancient history, going back to the triumph of Christianity, and the treatment with the prevailing triumphant Christianity meted out to the Jewish population, which were considered as the descendants of the murderers of Christ, with all the consequences this implied. So in other words, the religious roots of anti-Semitism. And remember, I think I mentioned that when you go through history, that these religious features of anti-Semitism in the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, were only eliminated as late as the Council of Vatican II, that is of the late 50s, early 60s in our century. That there were prayers in the Catholic Church which meant save us or liberate us from the wicked Jews, and similar kind of prayers existed in the Catholic rituals and in the Catholic liturgy. So in other words, the religious elements in which Catholicism and the Catholic Church played a very important role. This remained the background. Then came other elements. Other elements came and played a role in, let's say, in the kind of isolation which the Catholic governments imposed on the Jewish population in the Middle Ages. The ghettoization had as a concept, and also the prohibition, the interdiction to practice certain trades, certain professions, practically forced the Jews in those days to specialize in banking, for instance, in trading, in banking, and in the medical, all kinds of professions which were open to them because for reasons of different nature, they were not supposed to be good for Christians. And this had as a consequence that jealousy, greed, and hatred against the Jews for economic and for financial reasons developed in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages you had also the kind of explosions, the popular demagogical explosions against the Jewish people as being a minority, exposed to the outbreaks of hostility of the Christian majority. Then afterwards, in modern times, when the Jewish population was given equal rights from the French Revolution on, this brought about also an evolution of anti-Semitism, because all the other elements which existed from earlier days continued to play a role. The religious element, the greed, the financial element, and then another element which I also developed, that was the necessity for the Jewish population and for the Jewish parents to give a tough education to their children, so that they should be in a position to prevail, to have their place in society. And so this had as a consequence that they were better in many ways, like the majority of the surrounding population. And this, of course, exposed them to the jealousy. And all kinds of rumors were passed, that these rumors of conspiracies and so on. with nonetheless one element which was, I would say, an attitude of the Jewish people themselves, which proved to be used by the majority and turned against them. That was their attitude of staying apart from the surrounding population, of keeping to themselves in terms of marriages, in terms of other contacts and so on. In other words, this kind of self-practiced isolation played against them, even though there was nothing wrong in this, but in terms of mass psychology, this was used against them. In the evolution of the 19th century, when nationalism developed, the Jews were exposed to the blame of being bad citizens. Their double allegiance to their Jewish, let's say, ethnic, cultural, and religious community on the one side, and to the political community of the country in which they lived on the other side. The nationalists, they accused them of being bad citizens, of not giving first priority to their allegiance to their country rather than to their religious community. Ultimately, when Darwinism spread and a number of unserious, demagogical ideologues and let's say would-be demagogues spread the idea of superior and inferior races, the Jewish people were just practically treated not as an inferior race but as a wicked race, which all was of course fabrication, but nonetheless this was added to the already existing elements of anti-Semitism which we have traced up, and this created then this murderous anti-Semitic conviction which was shared by very few individuals, but which Hitler developed in his sick brain, that the Jews were the deadly enemies of the superior Aryan race and had to be exterminated. These were the ingredients of anti-Semitism as they developed in history, and as one element practically always played together with all the others and created this kind of dangerous situation where racialism and anti-Semitism together became a key element of this ideology which we call National Socialism. Now you add to your notes, which I briefly tried to review, you add Davidovic's development on the Jews in Hitler's mental world and also anti-Semitism in Germany. Okay, let me then repeat. We saw then Hitler's curriculum, his family background, his Vienna years, his World War I experience. And then we turn to the development, to his political career. Before we saw the evolution of the Weimar Republic, from its beginnings through the crisis through which it went from 1919 until 1923. And then we saw Hitler's coming on stage and how he turned around and made the splinter party into the National Socialist Party from 1919 until his coup of 1923. The coup itself, the consequences, the lessons, and then the evolution of the Weimar Republic from 1924 to 1929, and there we are, practically where more or less we started today. Okay.